August 4th, 1984. The Norwegian Sea, far below the surface, where the water is blacker than night and the pressure is strong enough to snap oak beams like toothpicks, a shape was moving. It was sleek, streamlined, and eerily silent. It did not look like the rough, utilitarian steel beasts of the Second World War. It looked like something grown in a laboratory. Inside the command center, the air was tense, but it wasn't the tension of combat. It was the tension of exploration. The depth gauge was the only thing that mattered. 600 meters. This was the crush depth for most American attack submarines. To go deeper was suicide. 800 meters. This was the limit of the brave. The hull should be groaning, the steel molecules compressing until they failed. 900 meters. The abyss. But the captain, Yuri Zelensky, watched the needle keep moving. The boat didn't groan. It didn't shudder. It slid through the deep water with an arrogance that defied physics. 1,000 meters. 1 kilometer down. 1,027 meters. They stopped. They hovered there in the crushing silence of the true deep. At this depth, the pressure was over 100 atmospheres, more than 1,500 pounds per square inch pressing against every inch of the hull. If a window cracked, the water wouldn't just leak in. It would enter as a supersonic jet capable of cutting a man in half. But they were safe. They were untouchable. They were sitting inside the K-278, the only ship of her class. NATO called her Mike. The Soviets simply called her Plavnik, the Finn. But to the sailors who knew the astronomical cost of her construction, she had another nickname, the Golden Fish. She was the deepest diving combat submarine in history. And she was special because of what she was made of. She wasn't made of steel. She was made of titanium. To understand the tragedy that would come 5 years later, you have to understand the metal. Titanium is the holy grail of submarine engineering. It is as strong as steel, but half the weight. It is non-magnetic, meaning it is invisible to the magnetic anomaly detectors, MAD, used by American patrol planes. And crucially, it is immune to corrosion. A titanium submarine could theoretically live underwater forever. But titanium is a nightmare to work with. It is stubborn. It cannot be welded in open air because at high temperatures it reacts with oxygen and becomes brittle. To build the K-278, the Soviet Union had to construct a massive, hermetically sealed shipyard hall at Severodvinsk. Workers wore spacesuit-like protective gear, welding the hull sections in an atmosphere of pure argon gas. It was an engineering project on the scale of the Apollo program. The result was a hull that was light, incredibly hard, and capable of withstanding pressures that would turn an American Los Angeles-class submarine into a crushed piece of origami. For 5 years, the K-278 was the ghost of the ocean. She was a laboratory for the future of Soviet naval power. She carried torpedoes and cruise missiles with nuclear warheads. She was highly automated, requiring a crew of only about 60 men, compared to the 100 on standard boats. She was faster, deeper, and quieter than anything else. The crew felt invincible, and why wouldn't they? They were riding in a shell of the most expensive metal on Earth, protected by the finest engineering the USSR could produce. They were the elite. To serve on the Komsomolets, named in 1989 after the Communist Youth League, was the highest honor in the Northern Fleet. April 7, 1989, 5 years after that record-breaking dive. The K-278 Komsomolets was returning from a long patrol in the Atlantic. She was cruising in the Norwegian Sea, about 100 miles southwest of Bear Island. The Cold War was thawing. The Berlin Wall was just months away from falling. But out here, in the gray swell of the Arctic, the game of cat and mouse continued. The submarine was commanded by Captain First Rank Evgeny Vanin. Vanin was a seasoned officer, respected by his men. He looked forward to getting home. The patrol had been successful. The ship was performing perfectly. They were cruising at a depth of 380 meters, 1,250 feet. They were moving slowly, at 8 knots. The reactor was humming quietly. The off-duty crew members were relaxing, playing chess, writing letters home, or sleeping in their bunks. It was a routine day. The kind of day where complacency is the invisible enemy. At 11 a.m., the watch changed. The ship was divided into 7 compartments. Compartment 1, the torpedo room. Compartment 2, the command center, the brain. Compartment 3, living quarters and batteries. Compartment 4, the reactor room. Compartment 5, turbines. Compartment 6, auxiliary turbines. Compartment 7, the steering gear and electric motors, the tail. The layout is important. In a submarine, survival depends on containment. If something goes wrong in one compartment, you seal it. You sacrifice it to save the ship. It is a brutal binary logic. At 11:03 a.m., Seaman Nogari Buknikashvili was on duty in Compartment 7, the very stern of the boat. He was alone. Compartment 7 was a lonely place. It was filled with the heavy machinery that moved the rudder and the backup electric motors. It was filled with hydraulic lines, high-voltage cables, and compressed air systems. Buknikashvili was likely checking the gauges, perhaps thinking about his leave in Severodvinsk. He didn't know that a microscopic failure was occurring in the electrical system behind a panel. A wire, perhaps frayed by vibration or flawed from the factory, sparked. In a normal room, a spark is nothing. But a submarine is not a normal room. To enrich the air for the crew during long dives, the oxygen levels are sometimes elevated. And in the bilges, trace amounts of oil and hydraulic fluid can accumulate. The spark hit a mist of oil residue. It wasn't a slow burn. It was an explosion of flame. At 11:03 a.m., a warning light flickered on the main control panel in Compartment 2. Temperature high, Compartment 7. Captain Vanin saw the light. He grabbed the intercom handset. Compartment 7, report. Buknikashvili, report. There was no answer. Just the static of a dead line. Then the voice of the engineer rang out, terrified. Fire in 7. Temperature is spiking. It's over 70 degrees. Vanin didn't hesitate. He knew the drill. Fire is the submarine killer. At 380 meters deep, there is no fire department. There is nowhere to run. Seal Compartment 7. Activate LASH, Chemical Fire Suppression System. Freon gas was dumped into the stern compartment. It should have smothered the flames instantly. The crew in the control room waited for the temperature to drop. They waited for Buknikashvili to call in, coughing but alive. Instead, the temperature gauge didn't stop. It accelerated. 100 degrees, 200 degrees, 500 degrees. What Vanin didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that a high-pressure airline in Compartment 7 had ruptured in the heat. The Komsomolets carried banks of compressed air to blow its ballast tanks. This air was feeding the fire like a bellows in a forge. It wasn't just a fire anymore. It was a blast furnace. The pressure in Compartment 7 was skyrocketing. The fire was consuming everything, the rubber seals, the oil, the insulation, and the body of Seaman Buknikashvili. And now, the invincible titanium hull began to work against them. Titanium transfers heat differently than steel, but the real problem was the penetrators, the holes, where cables and pipes passed through the bulkheads from one compartment to another. They were sealed with materials that were not designed for the temperature of a star. The fire in Compartment 7 was getting so hot that it was literally melting the seals into Compartment 6. In the command center, the alarms began to scream. Not just one alarm. All of them. Fire in Compartment 6. Hydraulics failing. Turbine generators offline. The ship began to lose power. The nuclear reactor safety systems sensed the chaos and triggered ASCRAM. The control rods slammed into the core, shutting down the reactor to prevent a meltdown. The hum of the ship died. The Komsomolets lost propulsion. She was a 4,000-ton rock sitting at 380 meters, drifting, and the fire was moving forward, eating its way toward the center of the ship. Captain Vanin made the only decision he could. If they stayed down, they would burn or suffocate. Emergency blow. Blow all main ballast tanks. The engineer threw the levers. High-pressure air roared into the ballast tanks, displacing the water. The Komsomolets was designed to be buoyant. When the tanks blew, she didn't just rise. She rocketed. She shot upward through the water column, like a cork released from the bottom of a bucket. The depth gauge spun backward. 300. 200, 100. The crew grabbed onto railings as the deck tilted sharply. They were going to the surface. They were going to be safe. Or so they thought. Because as the submarine broke the surface of the Norwegian Sea, splashing down into the waves, the fresh air from the surface vents didn't save them. It fed the beast. The submarine was no longer a secret weapon. It was a chimney. And inside the titanium shell, the temperature was rising to a point where the metal itself was threatened. The nightmare of the underwater oven had just begun. April 7th, 1989, 11:16 a.m., the Norwegian Sea. The surfacing was violent. The K-278 Komsomolets, lighter than she should have been due to the emergency blow, erupted from the gray swell of the Arctic Ocean like a breaching whale. She hung in the air for a split second, water cascading off her expensive titanium flanks before slamming down onto the surface. Inside, the crew was thrown against bulkheads and consoles. For a moment, there was a collective exhale. They were on the surface. They could see the sky through the periscope. In the lexicon of submariners, the surface is life. Down below, you are dead. Up here, you have a chance. Captain Vanin climbed the ladder to the bridge at the top of the sail. He cracked the hatch. The freezing Arctic air rushed in, biting and clean. It should have been a moment of salvation. But when Vanin looked aft, toward the tail of the submarine, his heart stopped. The Komsomolets was not just smoking. She was breathing fire. The anti-sonar rubber coating on the outer hull anechoic tiles designed to make her invisible was blistering and peeling away. Smoke was pouring from the vents in the stern. The titanium hull plates in the tail section were glowing a dull, angry cherry red against the gray water. Below decks, the laws of thermodynamics were exacting a brutal toll. The fire in compartment 7 had not been extinguished by the freon gas. It had laughed at it. Fed by the ruptured high-pressure air line, the compartment had turned into a pressurized blast furnace. The temperature was now estimated to be over 1,000 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, aluminum melts, steel loses its structural integrity, and synthetic materials turn into toxic vapor, but the titanium hull held. This was the tragic irony of the design. A steel hull might have buckled or split, venting the heat into the ocean. The titanium was so strong, so perfectly engineered, that it contained the fire completely. It turned the submarine into a pressure cooker. The heat had nowhere to go but forward. It attacked the bulkheads separating compartment 7 from compartment 6. The seals around the cable penetrations melted. The fire jumped the gap. Compartment 6 was the realm of the auxiliary turbines. It was packed with hydraulic lines. When the fire breached the wall, it found a web of pipes carrying flammable oil under high pressure. The pipes burst. The oil atomized. A flashover occurred. Compartment 6 didn't just catch fire. It exploded into flame. The men inside Petty Officers Kolodilin and Berkulakov didn't stand a chance. The intercom line to Compartment 6 went dead instantly. Now the real killer emerged. It wasn't the heat. It was the smoke. The Komsomolets was a sealed ecosystem. When plastic, rubber, and paint burn in a confined space, they produce carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide. It is odorless, tasteless, and lethal. It binds to the hemoglobin in the blood 200 times faster than oxygen. The fire in the stern had destroyed the hydraulic controls for the ventilation system. The valves were stuck open. The ventilation fans, still spinning on residual power or battery backup, acted like a pump. They sucked the toxic black smoke from the burning tail and pushed it forward, driving it through the ducts into compartment 5, compartment 4, and finally into the living spaces of compartment 3 and the command center in compartment 2. The alarm sounded. Chemical alert. Dome breathing apparatus. The crew scrambled for their IDA-59s. The IDA-59 is not a simple gas mask. It is a rebreather. It doesn't filter the outside air, which was now smoke. It recycles the user's breath through a chemical cartridge to scrub out carbon dioxide and adds fresh oxygen from a small tank. It is a clumsy, heavy device with a rubber mask that covers the whole face. It takes time to put on. It takes training to use. In the chaos, seconds mattered. Some men fumbled with the straps. Others couldn't get a seal over their beards. Some of the kits were old, and the chemical plates had degraded. In compartment 5, the situation was becoming a horror movie. This was the main turbine room. The smoke rolled in like a physical wall, thick, oily, and black. The men inside couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. They were coughing, choking, their eyes streaming tears. They tried to find the valves to isolate the compartment, but they were disoriented. The carbon monoxide hit them before the fire did. It brings a strange lethargy. You feel tired. Your legs get heavy. You just want to sit down for a moment. One by one, the sailors in compartment 5 slumped over their consoles or curled up on the deck plates. They drifted into unconsciousness while the air around them turned into poison. Up in the command center, compartment 2, Captain Vanin was fighting a war on 2 fronts. He had to save the ship, and he had to save the crew. He ordered the radio operator to send a distress signal. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is K-278. Fire in aft compartments. Surfaced. Position ... single quotes, but the radio was jamming. The heat in the stern had melted the insulation on the antenna cables. The signal wasn't getting out cleanly. Vanin grabbed the handset and screamed the coordinates, hoping someone, anyone, was listening. At 11:41 a.m., the Northern Fleet headquarters in Severomorsk finally picked up the faint, garbled signal. The message was passed up the chain of command. Combat alarm. The Soviet Navy began to move. But the Komsomolets was far away. The closest rescue forces were aircraft Ilyushin IL-38 Maritime patrol planes stationed on the Kola Peninsula. They scrambled, but it would take hours to get there. Back on the boat, the fire was winning. The electrical system began to die. The short circuits caused by the melting cables triggered a cascade of failures. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the ship into darkness. Illuminated only by the emergency battle lanterns, eerie red lights that made the smoke look like blood. Then, the reactor protection systems finally gave way. The reactor was already shut down, but the cooling pumps needed power. The emergency diesel generator should have kicked in. It didn't. The intake for the diesel generator was aft. It sucked in smoke instead of air. The engine choked and died. The ship was now running on batteries, and the batteries were draining fast. Captain Vanin realized that the internal fight was lost. The aft compartments were gone. The midship compartments were gas chambers. The only safe air was outside. All hands on deck. Evacuate non-essential personnel to the casing. The hatches were thrown open. The crew began to stumble up the ladders. They emerged into the blinding daylight of the Norwegian Sea, tearing the masks off their faces, gasping for the cold, salty air. They looked like coal miners. Their faces were blackened with soot. Their uniforms were stained. Some were vomiting from smoke inhalation. Others were dragging their unconscious shipmates. But not everyone could leave. A skeleton crew had to stay below to manage the buoyancy. If they all left, the ship might sink with the hatches open. Vanin stayed. So did the boat's engineer, Captain Second-Rank Valentin Bebenko. They were in the command center, watching the gauges through the haze of smoke that stung their eyes. They noticed something terrifying on the trim indicators. The ship was settling by the stern. A fire in compartment 7 had burned through the seals of the main ballast tanks. The high-pressure air that kept the ship afloat was leaking out. Water was rushing in to replace it. Usually, a titanium submarine is rigid. But the heat was so intense, now estimated at over 800 degrees Celsius in the tail, that the physical properties of the metal were changing. The stern was getting heavy. Outside, on the deck, the sailors huddled together. The wind was picking up. The waves were washing over the low aft deck. They watched in horror as the steam sizzled when the waves hit the hot titanium of the tail. Then a sound from the sky. A drone. A low rumble. The sailors looked up. Breaking through the low cloud ceiling was an Il-38 May. It had a red star on its wings. The men waved frantically. They cheered. The pilot dipped his wings, signaling he saw them. He couldn't land. It was a patrol plane, not a seaplane, but he could drop rafts. He could guide rescue ships. Hope, that cruelest of emotions, surged through the survivors. We are seen. Help is coming. But the pilot of the Il-38, looking down, saw something the crew on the deck couldn't fully appreciate. He saw the angle of the ship. The tail of the Komsomolets was sinking. The bow was rising. She was beginning to point toward the sky. And inside the hull, the underwater oven had finished its work on the machinery. Now it was coming for the pressure hull itself. The compressed air bottles in the stern, heated to critical temperature, were turning into bombs. The Komsomolets wasn't just sinking. She was about to be torn apart from the inside. April 7th, 1989, 5:08 p.m., the Norwegian Sea. For hours, the Komsomolets had fought to stay alive. It had been a stubborn battle against physics, a 4,000-ton Leviathan refusing to die. But the ocean is patient. It waits for the smallest weakness, and once it finds it, it is relentless. On the deck, the surviving crew members huddled in the freezing wind. The Il-38 patrol plane circled overhead, helpless to do anything but watch. The rafts had been dropped, but the wind had scattered them. The men were exhausted, their faces blackened with soot, their lungs burning from the toxic smoke they had inhaled. They watched the stern of their ship with a growing sense of horror. The tail was no longer just low. It was gone. The water had swallowed the aft stabilizers. The angle of the deck, which had been a manageable slope, was becoming a cliff. The titanium hull hissed as the waves washed over the superheated metal of the stern compartments, sending clouds of steam drifting into the gray sky. Then the ship gave up. It happened quickly. A bulkhead in the stern finally collapsed under the pressure of the invading water. The buoyancy vanished. The Komsomolets reared up like a dying stallion. The bow rose high into the air, exposing the sonar dome and the torpedo tube shutters. The ship stood almost vertical, a monolithic tombstone of black and gray against the horizon. For the men on the casing, there was no choice left. One by one, they slid or jumped into the Norwegian Sea. The water temperature was 2 degrees Celsius, 35 degrees Fahrenheit. When a human body hits water that cold, the shock is immediate. It knocks the air out of your lungs. Your blood vessels constrict violently to save heat for the core organs. Your hands and feet go numb within minutes. Without a survival suit, you have perhaps 15 minutes of consciousness. Most of these men were wearing standard cotton uniforms, soaked in sweat and oil. As they flailed in the water, trying to reach the distant rafts, They looked back. They saw their ship, the pride of the Soviet Navy, sliding backward. It didn't plummet. It glided, slipping smoothly beneath the surface with a terrifying grace. The conning tower disappeared. The bow vanished. A massive whirlpool of bubbles and debris churned the surface, and then ... silence. The Komsomolets was gone, but she wasn't empty. Inside the pressure hull, the nightmare was just beginning. When the ship tilted for its final plunge, Captain Evgeny Vanin was still in the command center, compartment 2, along with a handful of officers. They had stayed to the last second, trying to save the ship, trying to vent the ballast tanks, trying to communicate with the rescue forces. Also below was Captain 3rd Rank Anatoly Ispenkov, the electrical officer. Ispenkov is one of the unsung heroes of this tragedy. He was in the diesel generator room, fighting to keep the power on so his shipmates could see to escape. He never left his post. As the water rushed in, the generator died, and Ispenkov was swallowed by the dark. He remains on eternal patrol. In the command center, the world tilted 80 degrees. The floor became a wall. Heavy equipment, logbooks, and loose gear crashed down, smashing into the bulkheads. Vanin and 4 others, Captain 3rd Rank Yudin, Warrant Officer Slyasarenko, Senior Seaman Chernikov, and Warrant Officer Krasnobaev, found themselves trapped. They tried to reach the main hatch in the sail, but the angle was too steep, and the water pressure outside was already holding it shut. The ocean was crushing the door with tons of force. They were entombed in a sinking titanium coffin. The depth gauge began to spin. 50 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters. They were falling into the abyss, but the Komsomolets had one final card to play. A secret weapon designed for exactly this moment. Unlike American submarines, which rely on lockout chambers and individual escape suits, a slow and dangerous process, Soviet designers had equipped their heavy submarines with a VSK, Splyvyushaya Spazitelnaya camera, a pop-up rescue chamber. It was essentially a lifeboat built into the sail of the submarine. It was a pressure-proof capsule, capable of carrying the entire crew in an emergency. It was located right there, in the sail, accessible from the command center. Vanin screamed over the roar of rushing water. To the chamber! Everyone into the chamber? The 5 men scrambled into the cramped, cylindrical pod. It was dark, illuminated only by handheld flashlights. The air was thick with the toxic smoke that had flooded the entire ship. They were coughing, their eyes burning. They slammed the bottom hatch of the capsule shut and dogged it down. They were now sealed inside a bubble within the sinking ship. Outside, the Komsomolets was passing 400 meters. She was picking up speed. The titanium hull was groaning under the pressure. If the submarine imploded before they could launch, the shockwave would crush the capsule like an egg. Vanin grabbed the release controls. The VSK was held to the submarine by heavy clamps. To launch it, they had to blow the explosive bolts and release the locking mechanism. Vanin pulled the lever. Nothing happened. The ship was listing heavily, and the deformation of the hull under the crushing pressure had jammed the mechanical locks. The capsule was stuck. They were at 600 meters, 800 meters, 1,000 meters. They were now deeper than the Komsomolets had ever gone. They were approaching the crush depth of the hull itself. The sounds outside were horrific: the shriek of metal compressing, the boom of imploding external tanks. Inside the pod, the 5 men were screaming, hauling on the levers, kicking the mechanism, praying. The clamps won't release. Yudin yelled, his voice ragged from smoke inhalation. They were falling toward the bottom of the Norwegian Sea, 1,700 meters down. If they hit the bottom, they would stay there forever. In a frenzy of desperation, Warrant Officer Slyasarenko remembered a backup system, the liquid gas release. It was a system designed to force the capsule off the hull using high-pressure gas. He found the valve. He didn't turn it gently. He wrenched it open. Boom! The explosive separation charges fired. The clamps shattered. A VSK broke free from the dying submarine. At a depth of nearly 1,600 meters, over a mile down, the capsule detached. The Komsomolets continued her lonely fall into the darkness, eventually settling into the mud at 1,680 meters, where she lies to this day, her nuclear reactor and 2 nuclear torpedoes still inside. But the capsule ... The capsule became a rocket. Freed from the massive weight of the submarine, the buoyant pod shot upward. The ascent was violent. It wasn't a gentle float. It was an uncontrolled vertical acceleration. Inside, the 5 men were pinned to the floor by the G forces. But they had a new problem. A deadly problem. As they shot toward the surface, the pressure dropped rapidly. But inside the capsule, the air was toxic. The smoke from the fire had entered the pod with them. Even worse, the rapid pressure change was affecting their bodies. They had been exposed to high pressure inside the sinking hull before sealing the pod. Now, as they ascended, the nitrogen in their blood began to bubble. It was the Benz decompression sickness hitting them in seconds rather than hours. They became dizzy, disoriented. Nitrogen narcosis set in. They were laughing, crying, losing their grip on reality, and they were breathing poison. The carbon monoxide concentration in the small capsule was lethal. They fumbled for the masks of the built-in breathing system, but in the chaos and the darkness, with the capsule shaking violently, it was a struggle. Senior Seaman Chernikov collapsed. He wasn't moving. Captain Vanin was fighting to stay conscious. Up, up, up. 1,000 meters. 500 meters. Surface. The capsule breached the surface of the Norwegian Sea like a missile. It flew entirely out of the water, hung in the air for a heartbeat, and then splashed down hard. They had made it. They had escaped a submarine sinking to the bottom of the world. It was a miracle of engineering and survival. But the tragedy of the Komsomolets was not done with them yet. Fate had one final, cruel twist in store. The capsule was floating, but the air inside was unbreathable. They had to get out immediately. Warrant Officer Slyusarenko, the man who had triggered the release, was the most alert. He scrambled up the ladder to the top hatch. He had to open it to let fresh air in. But there was a pressure differential. The air pressure inside the capsule was slightly higher than the outside air due to the rapid ascent and leaking gas. Slyusarenko grabbed the handle. He turned the latch. Usually a hatch opens gently, but the internal pressure acted like a loaded spring. The heavy steel hatch blew open with the force of a cannon. The blast of air caught Slyusarenko and threw him out of the capsule. He was launched into the sea, tumbling into the freezing water. But inside the capsule, the sudden depressurization caused a flash phenomenon. The toxic gases and unburnt smoke particles, suddenly mixed with a rush of fresh oxygen from the open hatch, ignited. A fireball consumed the interior of the escape pod. Captain Vanin, the man who had tried so hard to save his ship, the man who had stayed behind to ensure his crew got out, was right under the hatch. Slyusarenko, floating in the icy water, watched in horror. He saw the capsule bobbing in the waves. Smoke was pouring from the open hatch. He shouted for his captain. He shouted for Yudin and Chernikov. But no one came out. The capsule rocked in the swell. Waves washed over the rim of the open hatch. Slowly, water began to spill inside. The heavy pod, losing its buoyancy, began to settle. Slyusarenko swam toward it, but he was weak. He watched as the VSK, the vehicle that had performed the deepest rescue in history, filled with water and sank beneath the waves, taking Captain Vanin and 2 others back down to the darkness they had just escaped. Only Slyusarenko and Warrant Officer Krasnobaev, who managed to scramble out just before the flash, survived the capsule. Around them, In the freezing twilight, the rest of the crew, the men who had jumped from the deck, were singing. They were singing the Soviet anthem. They were singing to stay awake, to keep the cold from stopping their hearts. They were waiting for the fishing boats. They were waiting for salvation. But for 42 of them, it would not come in time. April 7th, 1989. Twilight. The Norwegian Sea. The silence that followed the sinking of the escape capsule was broken only by the sound of the wind and the coughing of dying men. 60 sailors were floating in the freezing Atlantic. They were scattered over a wide area, drifting among the debris of their vanished ship oil slicks, charred insulation, and empty life jacket crates. The temperature of the water was just above freezing. In these conditions, the human body shuts down with terrifying speed. The first stage is shock. The cold hits you like a physical blow, forcing the air from your lungs. Then comes the pain, a burning sensation in the skin as the capillaries constrict. Then the numbness. The hands lose their grip. The legs refuse to kick. Finally, the mind drifts away. You stop feeling cold. You start feeling warm, sleepy, and peaceful. That is the moment of death. The men of the Komsomolets fought against this with a desperation that defies description. They clung to each other to share body warmth. Those who had managed to inflate the small life rafts pulled their shipmates aboard, stacking men on top of men until the rafts were barely afloat. They sang. In the gathering darkness of the Arctic night, a choir of voices rose from the freezing water. They sang the anthem of the Soviet Union. They sang the Varshavayonka. They sang not out of patriotism, but out of survival. Singing forced them to breathe. Singing kept them awake. If they stopped singing, they would sleep. And if they slept, they would drown. But the cold was a relentless assassin. Men who had been joking a minute before suddenly went silent and slipped beneath the surface. Others, their muscles paralyzed by hypothermia, simply let go of the rafts. Overhead, the pilots of the Il-38 aircraft watched the tragedy unfold, helpless to intervene. They had dropped their radio beacons. They had called for every ship in the sector. But the ocean is vast, and ships are slow. It took 80 minutes for salvation to arrive. It wasn't a warship. It was the B-64 Alexei Klobestov, a Soviet fishing factory ship, a tender. It came steaming out of the gloom, its deck lights blazing like a cathedral. The fishermen lined the rails, throwing nets and ropes to the survivors. But for many of the submariners, it was too late. Their hands were frozen into claws. They couldn't grab the ropes. The fishermen had to climb down the nets, risking their own lives in the icy swell, to physically haul the sailors out of the water. Of the 69 men who had been on board the Komsomolets that morning, 27 were pulled from the water alive. But the dying didn't stop on the deck of the Klobestov. Several men, finally safe and wrapped in blankets, went into cardiac arrest. The shock of rewarming, combined with the massive inhalation of toxic smoke from the fire, was too much for their hearts. By the time the rescue operation was declared complete, the tally was grim: 42 dead, 27 survivors. Of the dead, only 4 had been killed by the fire itself. The rest 38 men had died waiting for rescue. They had escaped the underwater oven only to be claimed by the ice. Captain Evgeny Vanin, the commander, remained with his ship. His body, along with those of the 2 men who failed to escape the capsule, drifted down to the seabed inside the flooded VSK. They lie there still, eternal sentinels of the wreck. When the survivors returned to the Soviet Union, there were no parades. There was an inquiry, and in the dying days of the USSR, the inquiry was as brutal as the accident itself. The Soviet Navy Command initially tried to blame the crew. It was the standard procedure: blame the dead to protect the reputations of the living admirals and the design bureaus. They claimed the crew was incompetent, that they had failed to activate the fire suppression systems correctly, that they had panicked. But the survivors fought back. And as the Iron Curtain fell and the archives opened, the truth about the Komsomolets emerged. It wasn't just human error. It was hubris. The Komsomolets was a technological marvel, but it was also a death trap. The titanium hull, the pride of Soviet engineering, had contributed to the disaster. Titanium has a different thermal conductivity than steel. When the fire started in compartment 7, the hull didn't dissipate the heat into the ocean fast enough. Instead, it acted like a thermos, keeping the heat inside, allowing the temperature to reach levels that melted the seals of the bulkheads. The internal layout was flawed. The high-pressure air lines the very system meant to save the ship by blowing the ballast tanks had run directly through the high-risk zones. When they ruptured, they turned a manageable fire into a blowtorch. And the safety gear was pitiful. The inquiry revealed that the ship lacked enough survival suits for the whole crew. The life rafts were difficult to deploy. The escape capsule, VSK, while a brilliant concept, had never been fully tested under combat conditions. The tragic irony was that the smoke that killed Captain Vanin inside the capsule had likely come from the very fire he had fought so hard to contain. The Komsomolets was a symbol of the late Soviet Union, a glittering, expensive shell hiding a crumbling, dangerous interior. Today, the K-278 lies at a depth of 1,680 meters, 5,500 feet, in the Norwegian Sea. It is one of the most visited shipwrecks in the world, not by tourists, but by scientists. The submarine is not just a wreck. It is a nuclear hazard. Inside the crushed titanium hull sits a 190-megawatt nuclear reactor. The core contains a massive amount of uranium-235 and fission products like strontium-90 and cesium-137. But there is something even more dangerous. In the bow torpedo tubes, there are 2 Shkabal high-speed torpedoes armed with nuclear warheads. These warheads contain plutonium-239. Plutonium is highly toxic and has a half-life of 24,000 years. In the early 1990s, fears arose that the titanium hull, which was immune to corrosion, would ironically speed up the corrosion of the steel torpedo casings inside it due to galvanic reaction. 2 different metals in saltwater create an electrical current. If the casings breached, plutonium could leak into the rich fishing grounds of the Norwegian Sea. It would be an environmental Chernobyl in the ocean. Between 1989 and 1998, Russia launched 7 expeditions to the wreck using the Air deep-diving submersibles, the same ones later used to film the Titanic. They found the submarine sitting upright, its bow stuck in the mud. The damage was horrific. The outer hull was scorched and peeled. The torpedo tube doors were open. The scientists did something unprecedented. They decided to seal the tomb. Using robotic arms, they pumped a special jelly-like polymer into the torpedo tubes. This substance was designed to harden and encapsulate the warheads, preventing the seawater from eating them away. They covered the ventilation openings with huge titanium caps. They essentially tried to embalm the ship on the ocean floor. For now, the radiation levels around the wreck are low. The tomb is silent. The golden fish sleeps. But scientists warn that the polymer seals are temporary. They will last 20 or 30 years. Time is running out. Eventually, the ocean will eat through the containment. The story of the Komsomolets is a cautionary tale of the Cold War. It was a time when nations built machines that pushed the boundaries of physics, often forgetting the biology of the men inside them. The Soviet Union wanted a ship that could dive deeper than any other. They got it. They wanted a ship that was faster and harder to detect. They got it. But in their quest for the Invincible submarine, they created a machine that could not tolerate a simple spark. Every year, on April 7th, at 5:08 p.m., the exact minute the ship sank, the sirens of the Russian Northern Fleet sound in Murmansk. It is the minute of silence. It is a tribute to Vanin, to Buchnikashvili, to Ispenkov, and to the men who froze to death singing in the dark water. They were the elite. They were the crew of the Golden Fish. They rode the most expensive, advanced machine ever built by their country. And in the end, it wasn't an enemy torpedo that destroyed them. It was the fire within. History remembers the Komsomolets not for its depth records, but for the tragedy of its final ascent. It stands as a reminder that no matter how much titanium you use, no matter how many billions of rubles you spend, there is no such thing as an invincible ship. The ocean always wins.